It has been a long, arduous ride, but we have finally made it to the main point of this chapter. Causes of economic fluctuations. Let's examine the demand side in this video. Many people think that the Taeguk on the top right of the screen describes the balance of the universe. For economists, it has to be this graph right here. We have two factors: aggregate demand, the amount of total demand in the economy, along with aggregate supply, the amount of goods the businesses in the economy produce and sell. And that takes place in the short run and the long run. As we can see by this picture right here, the economy at this time is working at full employment, its natural level of output. It's working at about 4% unemployment, 3.5% unemployment, very low unemployment. It's ideal. It is also the stated goal, one of the stated goals of the Bank of Canada. One is for price stability. The other is to make sure that the economy is working at full employment. When it's not working at full employment, there are many resources, including human resources, that are not being utilized. It's always the Bank of Canada's goal to ensure we are running at full employment. And this is what this graph depicts at this moment. Now, let's suppose that a wave of pessimism overtakes the economy. What is the macroeconomic impact of such a phenomenon? Let's examine further. There are two reasons why we have fluctuations in the economy. It's an unexpected shift in aggregate demand or an unexpected shift in aggregate supply. So this video, of course, we're talking about shift in aggregate demand. And we know that by the title, but we also know that because this is the scenario. A wave of pessimism overtakes the economy, and of course, we know what influences aggregate demand, don't we? And we can see that, we can imagine, I guess, that a wave of pessimism overtakes the economy. If there were two factors, two components there of GDP that would be influenced the most, which ones would it be? Good job. Consumption and investment. If you're pessimistic about the economy, you're not as likely to buy a car, not as likely to buy furniture and things like that. Not as likely to spend money. You might be insecure about your job. But the major one, the big one, the one that has the most influence is investment. Investment almost stops when there's a wave of pessimism that overtakes the economy. Businesses find it very risky to start expanding in a time when the economy is contracting. So it's an investment that typically has a larger impact. Anyways, but I digress, I suppose. But anyways, so let's see what's going on. Number one, there are basically 4 steps in analyzing fluctuations. Let's go through them. Number one, let's talk about it. Aggregate demand or aggregate supply. Hey, we already talked about that. It's an aggregate demand curve in this case. And 2, what direction is the shift? We're talking about a wave of pessimism. The aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the, good job, to the left. So anyways, we were here at point A, which is here, but now we've moved to point B, and this is called the short run equilibrium. It's called the short run equilibrium because it's not on the long run aggregate supply curve. So when we're comparing these two, what do we notice? Are we producing more or less goods and services? We're producing less. And whenever we produce less goods and services because of shift, It's always called a recessionary gap. It doesn't matter if it's caused by a shift in aggregate supply or a shift in aggregate demand. If you're producing less goods and services now, in the short run, that's called a recessionary gap. And that's the distance between these two lines, people. All right, so what happens? Well, there's obviously some deflation, some price changes right away. But you know what? The price changes, it kind of goes through, like 2 stages. Prices will come down, but wages will stay up. We still have misperceptions about relative prices. Some people will raise the price, but not, or sorry, some people will lower the prices, but some people won't. You guys remember sticky wages, sticky prices, misperceptions. So that takes a little bit longer. So basically, when those 3 things have adjusted, sticky wages, sticky prices, and misperceptions, and all the input prices, like the price of oil and all that, when all that is adjusted in the long run, we go back to point C. What happens is inputs become cheaper, like wages are an input, A lot of things happen anyways, and we ended up with the aggregate supply curve will shift. And we will be at point C, producing now again at full employment, but with even a lower price level, because all the prices have already adjusted. All right, but hey, we're back on long-run equilibrium, but at a much lower price level. So that's what would happen if the government and the Bank of Canada did not step in to influence aggregate demand or take action to fix the economy. This is the textbook version of what I was just explaining. Pause the video and make sure that you understand. All right, so the next scenario here basically says that the government decreases GST. Okay, so anyways, that's going to affect the government reduces GST, it's going to affect consumption and it's going to affect investment. Consumption, definitely. I mean, it is called a consumption tax. Investment, of course. Businesses also consume a lot. GST is placed on new housing, for example. So these are some pretty big numbers here as far as our component of GDP. Housing is a major part of our economy. So regardless, okay, just moving right along here. So is this going to affect aggregate demand or aggregate supply? Number 1, aggregate demand. What direction is going to be the shift? Well, they're cutting consumption tax, so that's right, we're going to see it shift to the right. So we've moved from point A over here to point B over here, and we are producing to the right of our long-run aggregate supply curve, to the right of full employment. How can we do that? We're producing more goods and services than our capacity. Well, at least we can only manage that in the short run. We got grandma and grandpa working. We got people working overtime all the time. We've got people like in support positions working on the production line. We're doing whatever we can. And why? Because hey, aggregate demand curve just shifted and we see some inflation and we have misperceptions about that. I'm a wheat farmer and I think the price of wheat's gone up. Woohoo, I'm going to get rich. I'm going to start producing more. And, sticky wages, sticky prices, you guys remember that, right? And so we have some inflation and we start producing more goods and services. This difference between how much we're producing and our long-run aggregate supply curve, if it's greater than the long-run aggregate supply curve, it's called an expansionary gap. The economy is expanding, so we have an expansionary gap. It's also called an inflationary gap. All right. But after a while, Right? Because, inflation has gone up, and I think I'm a wheat farmer, I'm getting rich. Well, my employees, if I have employees, I haven't been increasing their wages. Yeah, because, hey, but after a while I have to. And, my misperceptions about prices, I just realized that everything's gone up. Butter has gone up. Anyways, I have more input costs as well. Everything's going up, so I have more input costs. So when my input costs go up, like wages and all the oil and all those kind of things, is my business going to become less profitable or more profitable? Less profitable. So in the long run, I'm going to adjust by decreasing the amount of goods and services that I produce. So the aggregate supply curve now is going to shift and go back to long run equilibrium. Is it going to shift to the left or the right? The aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left and meet at the long run aggregate supply curve here at point C. So we have even more inflation because wages go up, everything. Input prices go way up. Have I ended up producing more goods and services in the end, in the long run? No, I haven't. So this is what I mean by a government that is basically decreasing the GST at a time when the economy didn't need it. That causes an expansionary gap, which is only present in the short run. In the long run, it's going to correct, and we're going to end up with even more inflation. In other words, it wasn't very smart, was it? 3 important lessons for us to remember. In the short run, shifts in aggregate demand cause fluctuations in the economy's output of goods and services. In the long run, shifts in aggregate demand affect the overall price level. But in the long run, they do not affect the level of output, and that's because the aggregate supply curve will shift and correct itself and bring the economy back to full employment. Now, that might take a long, long time. How fast does it take to adjust people's wages, adjust prices, and clarify your perceptions about relative prices? How long does that take? 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years? It might take a long time. So basically what we're talking about here is we're talking about the economy as a self-correcting mechanism and how without any interference at all, the economy will move back to full employment in the long run. The problem is it may take too long. So often the government interdicts. They go in and interfere in the market. All right? So anyways, but that's all for chapter 15. For right now, all we are talking about in this chapter is basically, hey, if we just let this thing goes where it wants to, it will naturally go to full employment. It just might take a long, long time. So anyways, number 2, in the long run, shifts in aggregate demand affect the overall price level, but do not affect the level of output, not in the long run. 3, policymakers who influence aggregate demand can potentially mitigate the severity of economic fluctuations. And that is for chapter 15. Last one. Suppose the election of a popular president suddenly increases people's confidence in the future. Use the model of AD and AS to analyze the effect on the economy. Currently producing at full employment, we get more confidence in the economy. AD or AS? AD, aggregate demand is going to shift to the right or to the left? To the right. What are we going to experience? A recessionary gap or an expansionary gap? When we move from point A to point B, we're producing above the long-run aggregate supply curve. That's an expansionary gap or an inflationary gap, sometimes we call it. Price levels are going to go up. I'm going to think, wow, the prices for my products are getting higher. I'm going to make more money. I start selling more and more goods and services, but I don't raise the prices of my employees already. For whatever, I start producing more. Everyone's working overtime. Kids and grandma come into the marketplace. It's going to drive up prices, including the price of labor, by the way. So more people are enticed to work. But is this going to happen in the long run? Answer, no. In the long run, sticky wages and prices will rise. And that causes a shift to the left of the short-run aggregate supply curve. Basically, as I raise everybody's wages and all the input prices also go up because of inflation and all that, producing goods and services does not become as profitable as I thought. And I will start producing less. And what will be the impact? Even higher prices. So we'll move up to PL3, but we'll end up producing back at full employment in the long run. So did it really work out for the economy in the long run? Not really. All we've ended up with is inflation.